Terrific. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We're just going to give it another minute or two for some people to shuffle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, great. I think we can go ahead and get started. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We're really excited today to bring you a webinar on decarbonizing hotel food systems. We got a great group of experts here to talk about it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the CEO of the World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, Glenn Manzik.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And it's a big honor to be able to release a real important discussion and white paper on decarbonizing our hotel food systems. It's a significant opportunity to really tackle climate action and be a real contributor to society and the planet. And so this is a great conversation I'm looking forward to have with some real, quite frankly, leading experts in this space. And Rupert Simons, who's Director for Food and Nature with Systemiq, and Erica Harms, who's the Global Director for Sustainability for Iberostar, who both have been significant partners with the World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, together with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, in advancing this initiative. So, Jack, if you can bring the slides up. Today's agenda, while Jack is bringing those up, today's agenda will revolve around the key findings of the paper, provide key examples of action taken to decarbonize hotel food systems. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we work together in collaboration as entities in order to really catalyze change when it comes to food systems innovation. And then finally, we're going to take, obviously, a series of questions and answers at the end. And certainly, I encourage everyone to put your questions into the chat box, and we'll tackle each one of those one by one at the end of the webinar. So with
Glenn,
that,
just a quick clarification. If everybody can put their questions into the Q&A chat box, that would be terrific.
Okay, great, Nicholas.
Thank you.
I didn't know there was a difference between the two. See, I'm learning all the time in the Zoom world. So there we are. So in the Q&A chat box, please fire your questions in there, and we'll follow up with that. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass over to Rupert, who's going to walk us through some of the key findings coming out of the report.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from London. I'm one of the leaders of the Nature Food Platform with Systemiq, a systems change company with a global footprint. We've been working on sustainability in travel and tourism now for the past 3 years. Very excited today to share with you the findings of the work that we've done together with World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance and Sustainable Markets Initiative on how to reduce emissions from food in the travel and tourism sector. Why is this an important problem? Well, think about how hotel food is produced, how it's consumed, and how it gets from farm to your plate. Food supply chains are complex to start with, and hotel ones more so. Hotels are called upon to provide multiple meals a day, sometimes round the clock. They have a much wider range of guest expectations and needs than typically restaurants or other food service environments do, and they may be located in remote locations, and yet with high expectations on the quality, availability, and freshness of the food that is provided. On the next slide, we've set out a few of the reasons this business that's challenging to start with is actually becoming more challenging. And you will all be familiar with examples. Here's just a few. First, climate change and extreme weather obviously make it more difficult for farmers to operate, but also make it more difficult to get food from farms through the supply chain and into hotels. And examples of that is what happens when heat and wildfires disrupt food production, but also when hurricanes, for example, in the Caribbean, disrupt the supply of food to hotels, as well as disrupting the flow of workers in the travel and tourism industry and the tourists themselves. Second, the degradation of nature and loss of fertile soils is a global problem for the food system and is particularly present in some of the countries that have high tourism inflows. Third, geopolitics can cause spikes in food price inflation. So when the Suez Canal is subject to attacks by Houthi rebels, that results in bulk carriers driving grain and rice around the world to take a detour via the Horn of Africa. That drives up costs. And flight routes don't account for a lot of food movement, but nevertheless do disrupt the tourist industry as they get longer and less predictable. Companies based in Europe or companies with very significant operations in Europe will be familiar, of course, with your reporting requirements under the Corporate Sustainability Responsibility Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Those are becoming more stringent. Initially, you just had to report your risks and exposure to them, as well as their business materiality. But in future, you'll also be required as economic actors to set targets for decarbonization and nature protection and to report on how that's going. The tourist industry, of course, as we know, is subject to political scrutiny and in some cases populist backlash at what are perceived to be mounting costs for local communities. And of course, global expectations are changing. On the one hand, people say they're willing to travel more sustainably. On the other hand, very few of them are willing to pay for it. And as economic growth is spread more widely and fragments, the customer base fragments with it. So now we'll take a look at some numbers, and on the next slide, start unpacking what makes hotel food systems challenging, but also what gives us opportunities for improvement. And the reason for this outsized impact is fundamentally the model of food that hotels are required or feel required to offer, whereby they have to provide up to 3 meals a day, and they need to avoid running out of options as that can result in poor reviews. This results in over provision, particularly in buffets, and the result of that is that although fewer than half of a percentage point of global meals a year are consumed in hotels, that less than half a percentage point accounts for something like 1% of global food production and something like 3% of global food waste. And the waste is in particular a consequence of over ordering, over preparing, so that you minimize the risk of running out of something, but in the process, of course, you run up the waste numbers. And this can be temporarily controlled by restrictions on buffets, for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic era, but those were generally unpopular with tourists. And so it is not surprising that the industry has moved away from those restrictions as travel restrictions were also lifted. On the next slide, we've compiled an estimate of what all of this means for the sector's emissions. And the headline number is that hotel food generates just under 200 million tons of emissions a year, 2/3 of which derives from the sourcing. So what does 200 million tons mean? It's roughly the same size as the total emissions of the Netherlands or the United Arab Emirates. So if hotel food were a country, it would be UAE sized. And where does that come from? 60% is from where food is sourced, which can include emissions from farming, food loss during production, and emissions-intensive menus, including meat and products that are the result of deforestation. There is then significant amount of waste, which we've already discussed in the context of buffets. Some of that arises in the kitchen at the preparation stage, but a lot of it arises at the plating stage, and some of it is also left over at the end of meal service. Plastic packaging is very prominent, accounts for a relatively small share of emissions, but is a priority for many hotel chains and also for their guests to address. And finally, kitchen operations, particularly when they're powered by gas or in some unusual cases also by coal, these are typically very energy intensive. There is significant waste of fossil fuels that arises from leaving gas burners on, and it does, of course, also contribute to local air pollution, particularly for the people working in kitchens. The good news, however, is that all of this can be addressed through technologies that already exist and practices that are already in operation. So on the next slide, we talk about how these emissions can be reduced. If we do nothing, then hotel food emissions grow to over 200 million tons by 2030, but they can be reduced by 20 to 30% through the application of 4 measures. Number 1, waste and source less. So that involves changes to menu structures, also changes to how food is presented in buffets. Second, sustainable sourcing, which principally relates to eliminating the consumption of food that has deforestation embedded in it. So that applies to some meat, especially to beef, but also to products containing soya and palm oil. And most of that is, in Europe at least, due to be eliminated anyway through the application of the EU deforestation regulations. So a lot of this is regulatory requirement as well as being in the interests of the industry's long-term sustainability. There is a reduction in footprint that can be achieved through using less plastic packaging and moving to reuse models, metal cutlery, and so on. And finally, there are significant reductions, up to 50%, that can be achieved by using energy more efficiently in the kitchen, principally through electrifying food preparation. All of this would result in hotel foods emissions falling to around between 150 and 175 tons per year, so taking them back effectively to where they were 10 or 15 years ago, in spite of very significant growth in visitor numbers during that period. So how do we do this? On the next slide, we've set out a few reasons that it's not always obvious how to do sustainable sourcing, and there's a few myths that we need to be aware of, a few traps that we would advise not to fall into. The first of is that although local sourcing is often popular with customers, it's not always more sustainable. If, for example, you are serving fresh fruit to customers in Northern Europe during the winter months, that has very likely been trucked from Spain and Morocco. But the footprint of doing so is actually less than serving fruit that is grown closer to the hotel in a greenhouse, because greenhouses burn gas to stay warm. And the total emissions from burning that gas are actually more than they would be from trucking the strawberries from Spain or Morocco. So you have to be careful. Unless fruit or vegetables are air freighted, local does not always result in more sustainable, although there are, of course, also benefits to local sourcing, such as building closer ties with local farming communities. Second, the role of plants and plant-based substitutes in combating deforestation. Now, the biggest culprit in deforestation is the meat industry, especially beef. There is significant cost from deforestation in soya as well as in palm oil. But because most soya is fed to animals, actually eating soya as a food, for example, in tofu or in plant-based milk alternatives, is quite a low emissions choice. Whereas meat is typically, even if that meat was produced in the country in which the hotel is situated, because of the footprint of the animal feed, which is often soy from a rainforest country, meat is typically still a high emissions choice, which strengthens the argument for hotels to make sure that there are plant-based alternatives to meat on the menu, not to eliminate meat entirely, but to make sure that the alternatives are available and delicious. Third, there is a point specific to beef, which you sometimes hear that beef is okay if it's grass-fed. And it's true that there's no deforestation associated with that, but unfortunately, grass-fed beef still has quite high emissions owing to the greenhouse gases produced by the cows themselves during rumination. So this is just a few of the pitfalls we need to be careful of when talking about sustainable sourcing. So what can we do? Next slide. Four options set out and then assessed in terms of costs, returns, and payback period. So wasting and sourcing less is actually money saving for the hotel. There's a decent return on investment there, and the payback happens in the short term. Sustainable sourcing has higher costs. Sometimes you do end up having to pay more for it. So the return on investment is also lower. The payback is a bit longer term. Plastic packaging, changing how plastic packaging is used, using less plastic packaging and single-use packaging has relatively low costs. It doesn't have significant returns on investment either. It's principally about changing how kitchens and food serving environments operate, and in some regions is also tied up with changing customer expectations about what is fresh and what is healthy. And so there is a medium-term payback to that, but there are also some reputational benefits and regulatory benefits associated with it. Finally, kitchen energy use. So this mostly involves electrifying gas stoves. There is some cost to that. There is a medium return on investment. There's a long-term payback in financial terms. There's actually a short-term payback in terms of the health of the people working in the kitchens. As global temperatures increase and as it becomes physically more demanding to run a hotel kitchen all year round, all day round, the 2 or 3 degree reduction in temperature that you achieve from turning off gas cookers and electrifying is actually a significant benefit to the people working there, and also it makes the air healthier to breathe. There are fewer gas particles floating around. And so when this has been tried with chefs who are initially skeptical and used to the ease and rapid action of cooking on gas, actually modern induction stoves can achieve the same heat gain in a very short period. And so there's no apparent loss in the quality of the food or the chef's experience. So I think I will close there and hand back to Glenn to take us forward. Or am I handing to you, Erica?
I'm happy to take it over.
Very good.
Thank you, Rupert.
Thank you.
So thank you for that, Rupert. I think it sets the stage perfectly for bringing it down to what can we do at a hotel level. And using the Iberostar example, we're going to share some of the lessons learned that we have had. So based on what you saw before, there are 4 levers that we've been working on. One is sourcing more sustainable, and we have understood that it's not only being able to look for the more sustainable alternatives, but we need to change our supply chain. We need to work in partnership with our supply chain in order to achieve higher goals and faster goals. The second one is reducing food waste. And for that, we are working with AI, and I'm going to share what we are doing. Optimizing kitchen energy use is part of what we do in our overall decarbonization strategy. And we primarily do this going from what is the highest or quickest wins to the longer term returns that require more investment. And finally, using less single-use plastic, which, as you know, we've been rid of single-use plastic since 2020. These are all actions that can be undertaken by the industry, and we hope that these examples that we bring forward in the next slides can show that. So if we can move to the next one, we'll be talking about sustainable sourcing. We set out to meet a goal of 100% sustainably or responsible seafood by 2025. That is next year. And we're happy to say that by the end of 2023, we had already reached 83% from this sourcing. It is not an easy task to do at first, but once you understand where your seafood is coming from, you can take action and work with these distributors in order to achieve a better and more traceable supply of seafood. The second component of this was understanding how we could work with local communities in order to improve the food that is coming from responsible sources around our communities. This is not always certified, and this is a challenge for those of us that started working on the certification process as the key driver of demonstrating success. But it is definitely one that changes how we see food, how we engage with communities. As I mentioned, this has to be done across the value chain, and I set the examples of seafood, but it's not the only thing we do. We are looking at what are the foods that we have with the highest footprint, and here are some of those examples: coffee, tea, sugar, and look at how we can engage the supply chain in tracing as well as reducing the footprint that we have from coffee, tea, sugar, and other products that are high in carbon emissions. Next slide, please. Reducing food waste is one that we wouldn't be able to do without two key elements. One is the engagement of people, and the second one is the use of AI. AI has allowed us to be able to trace what is coming into our bins and what is being discarded by our customers in the buffet, or what is the discard in our kitchens, and allowing us to make better decisions on what we serve, as well as educating our chefs on how to prepare meals that are less wasteful. And with that, we've been able to divert 56% of our food that goes to landfill. Our goal is that by 2025, there will be no waste going to landfill. And that requires education. It requires working with other stakeholders, but it also requires working with communities and destinations to find options by which we can give value to waste in order to achieve our goals better and have more impact. Next slide. Optimizing kitchen energy use, as I mentioned before, is a process. It allows us to reduce scope 1 and 2 by 12%, or we've been able to reduce it by 12% and 6% in energy consumptions. But most importantly, what we have done is created a way by which kitchens can trace and follow and take action in order to reduce. And this can be things that are as easy as putting a sticker on a refrigerator, ensuring that it's closed, or putting hours in which the ovens can be used and when they should be turned off instead of having them on the entire time. So these practices have been introduced, and training is completed periodically to ensure that people are following these guidelines. And these, as I mentioned, are quick wins. Also, when we do reforms, we invest in energy efficiency appliances, and we are proud to say that we have 7 hotels that are fully electrified. And we're moving to 100% electricity in Spain and renewable electricity in Spain and Brazil. Next slide, please. The use of less single-use plastic, as we mentioned, we are free of single-use plastic since the end of 2020. And this means 690 fewer tons of single-use plastic that is discarded. One of our success cases has been to move people to consume water through water fountains rather than plastic bottles. And then we have looked at how we better either reduce amenities or provide better amenities when requested that have a much better sustainable source. Next slide, please. So these are actions we have undertaken, but of course, this is just something that has to be undertaken by everybody else and for us to have a larger impact. And we believe that industry can be a driver of change if we collaborate, if we're willing to look at innovation and lead in the industry. So first thing we need to do is to set the industry-wide goals. Yeah. Oh, somebody. Okay, sorry. I just saw the slides move. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. And how can we do this? Well, WSHA provides a venue by which we can undertake this collaboration, set these goals, and move them forward. Driving sustainable procurement, working with our supply chain, and finding ways by which we collectively can drive suppliers by not only doing our individual requests, but rather coming together and working as a force, as a volume that will require our suppliers to change. We want to foster circularity, and we've shared some of the examples on how to do that. But we also want to engage stakeholders that go beyond the industry, communities, distributors. We can find solutions locally. We can bring value locally. And we have to engage our value chain if we want to drive change. Moving over to you, Glenn.
Thank you so much, Erica. You know, it's really inspiring, quite frankly, and I'm sure all of you out there are hearing that of specific actions that companies can do to really start to tackle the key issues that Rupert has identified in the strategy. It's really showcasing that if we work together collaboratively, we can make a significant impact on climate action and reduce our overall carbon emissions by taking the right steps, particularly within our food systems area. So what are we doing in the Alliance? Very important part here is, you know, establishing and continue to advance and update our waste management measuring tool for the industry. And currently we have a tool in place for hotel waste management methodology. This year, coming into this year, we want to significantly update that tool to bring into the latest alignment around certain protocols that need to be built into it, but also really making it much more approachable for our industry to utilize at the local level. Through our impact committees, this particular project, for example, came from our supply chain optimization impact committee within the Alliance. And these are the kind of initiatives that we will expect to come from our impact committee. So now when we start to get under the hood, if you will, of this report, the impact committee will be looking at that and seeing what some of those next steps could look like. We are making some bold actions right out of the gate when it comes to our new World Sustainable Hospitality Academy, together with the Academy at the Sustainable Markets Initiative, to host a series of masterclasses and webinars on bringing more of these elements to life that we're talking about, so that we can provide concrete actions that the industry can do, and that you can watch for in the coming days and months in 2025. And ultimately, we'll be building out certified trainings and tools. So again, enabling those that are practitioners that are involved in back of house and scaling action to ultimately take the action needed to do this. And as it states here, scaling up is key into action. And so sustainable challenges are, quite frankly, are too complex to do things in isolation. We, as an organization and as a collaborative effort, can no longer see these kind of things done in a silo. We have to break down the barriers and share in a pre-competitive way between each of the companies to move the needle where we need it to go. Shared responsibility, of course, every stakeholder from hotels to suppliers to guess the policy makers absolutely play a role in driving positive change. And, in order to do that, we have to educate. And that's why we wanted to take our big first step, update the tool of measure, but more importantly, ensure that everybody has the necessary understanding that we can make the change necessary to innovate. And obviously, innovation is necessary. And you heard a great example used by Iberostar with Winnow. There are so many other examples like that. We have to look at innovation to solve the solution. And as I mentioned, there are webinars to follow, and you'll expect to see more of those coming in 2025. And this is all about improving food systems from kitchens and the supply chain. So it's an exciting time, but it is an important time because this is an area where we can make a fundamental difference to the carbon emissions coming out of this industry by 2030 and ultimately hitting the targets that we're all setting. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass over to Nicholas, who will be looking into the Q&A chat box and seeing if we have any questions.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Yeah, and thanks, Rupert, Erica, and Glenn for sharing some insights. We do have some questions. Like I mentioned before, you can keep on filing the questions in, just insert them into, is for Erica, and they're asking if you can please explain what you mean by a fully electrified hotel.
Sorry, Nicholas, something happened with the communication and I couldn't hear your last comment.
My apologies. So one of the questions is asking if you can help please explain what you mean by a fully electrified hotel.
Yes, so we are moving all our consumption from sources to electricity in those areas where we have been provided by electricity from renewable resources. So we're moving away from gas, for example. And this means in kitchens, but not only in kitchens. Don't know how to clarify that in another way. Maybe the question can be rewritten a little bit. I'm sorry.
I'll see if they have any follow-up to that. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So the next question that we have is for Glenn, and they want to know if you can provide some examples of how it is that the sector as a whole can work towards the vision that's presented in this paper.
Well, the real important thing is engage. As it mentioned in the slide there about engage and collaborate, we have to learn from each other. So the only way we can really move it in a quicker way is each of the companies are doing some very unique things in this conversation. We need to bring those best practices together so that we can share with each other and learn from each other. Otherwise, it's a very daunting task. We all know that. And people, a lot of the industry, of course, are very time deprived on this effort. So we need to learn from each other so we can catalyze that change. So we will provide that framework within our, as I mentioned, our impact committees and through our various initiatives like this paper, which is designed to not only inspire our work as an alliance, but to inspire our partners to look at and take on the cause. Look at what this is, because this is probably one of the most significant things we can do as an industry to tackle and reduce our carbon emissions. And so if we really tackle this in a very significant way, I think Rupert referenced it very well. If you compared our emissions to a country like the UAE, then that says that we have a lot of work to do to make that transition happen. So this is where a powerful opportunity, that's why an alliance like this has been created, is to really get that collaborative energy together.
Terrific. Thank you. This next question here we have for Erica, which is for hotels that are maybe a little bit more advanced in their sustainability journey. Do you have any recommendations for them as it pertains to decarbonizing food systems? Maybe these hotels are already meeting targets. Do you have any recommendations for maybe some advanced type of work that they can begin doing?
but it's hard to say how advanced they are. So I think we assume you have your quick wins that I've already talked about. So this is where you go into investments on one end, and the other one is engagement with the community. So what we've found is when we hit the limit of what can we do that is an easy fix, we set up a program that's called Destination Stewardship, and that is working with the communities or the destinations or the governments on how we reach the targets, because they're not solely dependent on us. So we're looking at, for example, we've done everything to get value out of waste. So what's the next step? So how do we address waste to energy so that waste to energy is something that is not more polluting or has a higher footprint than if we send it to landfill. So doing that analysis and working with the destination. In some areas, we just simply don't have infrastructure. So how do we go out and partner with other companies in order to create the infrastructure to deal with waste? Aruba is a case where waste management is very difficult. So how do we work with the government and other hotels to identify options that can deal with organics or recycling? So that would be my suggestion, is reach out to others and find ways that we can collaborate in order to reach that next step that is beyond the capabilities that we have.
Really great. So this next question that we have is for Rupert, specifically highlighting if there anything surprising during the development process for the white paper. And we also have some questions on some of the data collection process in terms of establishing baselines. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how that was established during the development process.
Thank you, Nicholas. So on the baseline, so we've drawn principally on two reports for the sizing of the emissions. As the first is a piece that our team did a few years ago called Better Travel and Tourism, Better World, and I can share a link to that where we went through the total emissions of the hotel sector, which has provided some of the baseline information that we then used to do this deep dive into food. Because the sourcing is such a significant part of the footprint, we then went into more depth on the type of food that is being served in hotels and the emissions footprint associated with that, as well as the waste footprint associated with that. We got some useful data from the team at Winnow that has been working with Iberostar and many other hotel groups on the reduction of food waste in food service settings. And we've also drawn heavily on the research of Pour and Nemecek at Oxford University, which you can find amongst others on the Our World in Data page, and I can share a link to that as well. One of the other questions that that I wanted to address was also on how to educate the customer. And there's some interesting research that we drew on from the World Resources Institute on how to structure food choices in food service settings so that people are pushed towards making choices that are both healthier for them and healthier for the planet without getting into the space of lecturing them and trying to avoid restricting choice too much, and I will post a link to that work as well. It's called the Food Service Playbook, and it comes from the Cool Food Initiative at the World Resources Institute. They haven't got a chapter specifically on hotel food, but a lot of what they say on food service more broadly, we think, is applicable to the hotel food question. And then you can, of course, do more on behavior change once you start going down the education route. But I think the challenge that educating people while they're on holiday is always going to be harder than promoting a base level of education before people go on holiday. And one question that I sometimes wonder is whether booking platforms could do more to incorporate the carbon footprints of different properties or different into their booking choices in the same way that they already do the footprint of air travel, for example. And technically, I think that should be entirely entirely feasible. Whether there's really demand for it, I guess, is a separate question.
Really great. And I think that's a great transition into one of the next questions that we have, which for Glenn or Erica, I think would be great, is what's the single most important issue that we need to educate consumers about to help the transition to more sustainable tourism?
The
And you want to
single
take this?
greatest, well, that's an interesting one. A single greatest, yeah. I think it's just making better choices. And I think one of the things that Rupert talked about is, we as an industry can provide that springboard of thinking for the consumer to look at. And it is making, for want of a better word, some of the more healthier choices or the more plant-based choices, and to stick with this conversation, more sexier on the menu. It's like it's really educating your teams to bring that to light. That these are really important. The chef is focused on this type of delivery, and you want to make it more exciting for the consumer, because the consumer is very interested in learning more about the local environment, the local community. That's why they're traveling into those places. They want to immerse themselves into the local stories. We know that as an industry. So how do we layer that into the actual conversation when it comes to delivery of sustainable products for the consumer? So I think it's really important for our industry to make those nudges for making those more sustainable choices, by not lecturing, as Rupert explained, but actually showing the value proposition for the consumer to make those choices. And I think that's when we'll start to see the change necessary from the consumer side, because there's a real opportunity for hospitality to be sort of that incubator of ideas for the consumer to take back home with them, and practice those sustainable practices back at home. So this is where this is the opportunity, particularly on the food side.
I appreciate that, Glenn.
Nicholas, I think one of the things that we have tried to do from Iberostar is not only the communication, which we do with the seafood side of things, but actually show options to the client and provide examples by just setting up the food in a different way. So the food is there, it looks nice, and they taste it, they see it. So it doesn't require that much of a talking about it, but rather taste it, and you'll find that it looks good. And one very neat example that we had actually in one of our sustainability conferences in Mexico was that somebody from the bar decided to make a drink and was telling the story of how they were using the leftovers from the pineapple in order to make this particular drink, and transforming that. And it becomes now a story to the client, hey, you're drinking this, which represents that we're saving this much in pineapple waste. So fun ways in which, as Glenn said, fun ways in which you put that together so the consumer can see it without it being in your face.
That's really great. Thanks so much, Erica and Glenn. Erica, this next question is directed to you, asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on how AI, specifically Winnow inside the kitchens, is helping to decrease the amount of food waste within the operations of the hotel.
Yeah, I think there's two components to how we take action that are very important. One is setting baselines, one is setting baselines, and the other one is understanding actually what we're talking about. So it's easy to say we're wasting food, but until you start to measure how much food you're measuring, you're wasting, and what type of food you're wasting, it is only just the assumptions that we're making. Once it goes into AI, you're understanding not only the volume of waste, but the type of waste. So is it tomatoes? Is it tomatoes coming from the buffet, or is it tomatoes coming from the kitchen? And once you can align where the waste is coming from, then you can start taking actions, be it, do we need to change our menus because our menus are offering items that people are throwing away, hence let's just not serve that. Or we have problems in the way prepping is conducting in our kitchens. But AI comes into this equation by allowing us in a very effective way, rather than having a person, which we used to have limited measurements through people and scales. But now through AI, we're able to do that in a much more effective and quicker way.
Really great. Thanks so much, Erica. And then, Rupert, I know that you kind of highlighted on this before, speaking about some of the ways in which we gather the data. And I know that you were sharing some of the documentation. This individual is asking if you have the technical documentation on the estimated share of emissions from the hotel industry, and specifically the carbon emission gains from each lever.
Yeah, that's in the report. So if we could perhaps also put a link to the report and when we can expect that to go live, that will hopefully answer many of these questions. I don't have a technical annex to share. I mean, so what is in the report is what we can share. But I have been sharing both in what I've said and in the chat links to some of the source data that's based on. So hopefully there's no surprises. And if anyone's interested to talk through this with us further, then they can email me, and we're happy to book a follow-up conversation.
Great. And then just another quick follow-up that we just received from somebody. How complex is the regulatory framework to achieve a farm-to-table to farm circularity, and making sure that you achieve that type of circularity within the food system?
Shall I answer that, or attempt to answer that? So I think it works. It works a lot more easily for feeding animals than for feeding people. So it's legally possible and encouraged in most countries to feed food waste to animals, and then for that food to then re-enter the human supply chain. What you typically can't do, and there are very good legal reasons for this, is that you can't put without very extensive cleaning and depathogenization, put human waste or indeed animal waste into food that is then going to go straight to people. So there are legal restrictions on that for good reasons. That's also to stop the accumulation of toxins and hormones sometimes used in some kinds of food production into the supply chain. So the way that we recommend people to think about circularity is to design out waste from the beginning. So to eat and prioritize through food choices the kinds of food that are associated with less waste to start with, and to farm more efficiently through using precision agriculture techniques, for example, so that you don't need as much mineral fertilizer in the first place, and in so doing, you're reducing the fossil footprint of that food, as well as reducing waste. So there are certainly opportunities for making better use of organic cycling, of composting, for example. That's particularly relevant in environments where there's no organic waste collection organized by municipalities, and then hotels can organize the composting for themselves. But the biggest lever, in our view, is still to design waste out of the system in the first place.
Really great. And we have time for one more question, which be directed towards Erica or Glenn, which is asking, what are some simple steps that a hotel can do just starting off in terms of decarbonizing food waste?
Erica, maybe I'll let you start that, and I can finish with how to connect with us on that next step.
Certainly. There's different areas where you can start for, as I mentioned during the presentation. One is just labeling places where you have energy waste, and by taking actions or reminding people of things like the door is open, the oven needs to be at this temperature, the oven needs to be on from this time to this time, off from this time to this time. That helps a lot. The measuring is another one, whether you do it through AI or start just measuring yourself with basic scales. It is another component to do. And the third one that I also was talking about is try to drive the client through food choices that you bring by making them attractive and exciting. This doesn't require you to change or their minds, but a piece of meat versus a really nicely presented something is good. One issue that we had, for example, is when we said, well, no lobsters all year round. So we're not serving lobsters when there is a restriction. And kitchen said that's not possible, but we found alternatives that were closer to lobster and presented them in a way that was attractive to the consumer. So no complaints on that side at this time. I won't say it didn't happen at the beginning, but as we move forward, now there's literally no complaints on that. So those are easy actions that you can take that don't require higher investments and obviously training that you can do to the staff for better understanding.
And then just picking up on that, as Rupert pointed out, and is that the report that is live, and you can go to the World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance.org website and obtain a copy of that. And in there, we'll have some directions that the industry is taking. But I think more importantly, from our end, is on that website also is our pathway to net positive hospitality, and it shows a 4-step approach, starting with the basics all the way going into more advanced, and really encourage you to take a look at those processes and projects and initiatives outlined in that pathway itself.
Really great. Rupert, Erica, Glenn, thanks so much for answering all of those questions. And with that, Glenn, I'll hand it over to you for just a quick closing.
Well, it was indeed an honor. Thank you, Nicholas, for emceeing that part of the conversation. Thank all of you for attending this important webinar will be now, as I've referenced, a series of many that we will have in 2025 that will really now get into those very specific topic areas on the supply side and within the kitchen itself, on the changes that we can do as part of an overall masterclass that will be featured on our World Academy for Sustainable Hospitality, as well as within our partner at Sustainable Markets Initiative. So I really look forward to seeing you engaged in those. And special thank you to Iberostar, who's been a real leader, as you've seen here today, but a real inspirator and quite frankly, investor in this work that we're releasing right now. And thank you to Systemiq, who's been also instrumental in our 5-year strategy for the Alliance, but now obviously with this white paper. We are talking about systems change. We have to change some of the practices that we're doing in order to hit the targets that we're looking at. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of those key areas where we can make effective change on our carbon emissions and our impact in the local community, more, quite frankly, than many other the topic areas that we talk about when it comes to sustainability. So we're looking forward to what 2025 will bring and the next step. So thank you all for attending.